The tragic case of Kelsey Smith highlights how laws and policies intended to protect privacy can sometimes hinder critical investigations. Kelsey, who disappeared after going shopping for a gift, was abducted in broad daylight and later found murdered just a month after her 18th birthday. Her case drew international attention and raised questions about the balance between individual privacy and public safety.
Before we continue, Christmas is almost here, and we've got something special for you. Imagine cozying up in the comfiest Christmas hoodies, designed to bring the magic of the holidays to life. Whether it's for you or the perfect gift for someone you love, our exclusive Christmas hoodies are here to make this season unforgettable. Don't wait. These one-of-a-kind designs are selling out fast. Visit uncoverizeshop.fourthwall.com now and grab yours before it's too late. And here's a little holiday treat. Use promo code CHRISTMAS to get 15% off your order. Let's make this Christmas the coziest one yet. Link is in the description.
Kelsey's abduction, captured on surveillance cameras in a busy shopping center, could not be quickly resolved because her mobile phone operator delayed providing location data, citing privacy laws. This delay obstructed the investigation, and by the time the information was obtained, it was too late to save her. The nearly week-long search for her ultimately led to debates and legislative changes, including the passage of the Kelsey Smith Act, which allows law enforcement expedited access to phone location data in emergencies. The story also delves into the life of Edwin Roy Hall, known as Jack Hall, who committed the crime. Born on April 17, 1981, in Lee's Summit, a small town straddling Missouri and Kansas, Hall came from a disadvantaged, low-income family. Outwardly perceived as a devoted husband and father, his actions revealed a much darker side, leading to the devastating events that unfolded in Kelsey Smith's case. Exploring his background and motives provides further insight into this deeply disturbing tragedy. Edwin's childhood was hard, if not to say harsh. Parents of the boy used in large quantities of hot drinks and illegal substances, not engaged in the upbringing of children and mistreated them. Later, Hall will tell about the fact that at the age of 5, he was intimately abused by his uncle, his father's brother, but unequivocally confirm or deny this statement is simply not possible. Many thought that this detail was invented by the perpetrator's lawyer in order to make his client look like a victim of circumstances at the trial and try to mitigate his punishment. But be that as it may, and at the age of 6, Edwin found himself in an orphanage after his father was behind bars and his mother was deprived of parental rights. In the following years, the boy changed several foster families. But each time, he was abandoned after a while and returned back to the orphanage. This was due to the uncontrolled aggression of the child, as well as his cruelty. From an early age, Hall showed sadistic tendencies towards animals. He liked to torture them and watch the suffering. The boy did not recognize anyone's authority, disobeyed his foster parents, stole, and ran away from home. His last foster family returned Edwin to state custody at the age of 15. This was after the teenager attacked his stepsister with a knife. Then the tragedy was avoided and the boy was pitted and not prosecuted. However, a year later, he again came to the attention of the police when he deliberately hit another orphanage pupil, who was much younger than him, on the head with a baseball bat. As an adult, Hall had no record with the police, and he seemed to have matured, taken charge, and finally reformed. At the age of 20, he married a girl named Alita, who bore him a son a year and a half later. Edwin got an old Chevrolet truck from the 70s on which he worked, transporting various goods. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, humble, and friendly guy as well as a good family man. However, he also had another secret life, which became known only when Hall found himself in the dock for committing serious crimes. Who was the victim? Kelsey Smith. Kelsey and Smith was born in 1989 on May 3rd in a place called Overland Park, which ranks as the second most populous city in the state of Kansas. She was the third of 5 children in the large and very close-knit family of Gregory and Missy Smith. Growing up alongside her older brothers Steve and sister Lindsay, as well as her younger siblings Caddy and Zach, she was very close to all of them. The family patriarch, Gregory Gregg Smith, was a former military man and a veteran of the United States Navy. He had also served in the police force for over 2 decades and was now enjoying his well-deserved retirement. Meanwhile, the mother, Missy Smith, had dedicated her life to health care, having worked for many years at one of the local hospitals. Despite her professional commitments, she brilliantly managed to balance work with raising her numerous offspring and creating a cozy home environment. From a young age, Kelsey was an extremely active, sociable, and theatrical child. She loved to sing and dance, attended a music school where she learned to play several musical instruments, and eagerly participated in school theater productions and choir performances. In addition to this, she thoroughly enjoyed gymnastics and loved soccer, often attending various sporting events with her father and brothers, and she was a fan of the local team. Young Smith had many friends, possessed a great sense of humor, was talented in numerous areas, and knew how to make a good impression on those around her. She also had a profound love for animals from childhood and dreamed of going to college after high school to pursue a career as a veterinarian. In her senior years of high school, Kelsey took a job in the local orchestra where she played the clarinet, performing at various city events. This job allowed her to save enough money in just 6 months to buy her first personal car, a 1987 Buick Regal. Her parents weren't too fond of the fact that her car was older than she was and offered to add some money from the family budget to buy something more recent. However, it was crucial for her to purchase her first vehicle independently with her own money, so she declined their offer. Kelsey's personal life. It's noteworthy that the Smiths went to great lengths to provide their children with the very best, caring deeply for their education and holistic development. However, they also raised their offspring with a strong sense of discipline. There were clear rules in their home that everyone abided by without exception. For instance, all family members were expected to share their plans and always inform each other if they were going to be out late. Kelsey herself was always punctual, never late, and would always tell her parents where she was going and who she was spending time with. During her senior year, Kelsey entered into a romantic relationship with a young man named John Beersmith. According to Kelsey, it was a deep and mutual love at first sight, the kind you read about in books or see in movies. The couple rang in the new year of 2007 together, and from then on were practically inseparable. Smith's partner, a year her senior, appeared to be a serious young man who treated his beloved with the utmost care and respect. Both sets of parents approved of their children's choice and did not stand in the way of their relationship. In May 2007, Kelsey celebrated her 18th birthday. That same month, she graduated from high school and was thrilled to learn that she had been accepted into a prestigious college in Kansas where she intended to study veterinary medicine. The following days were, without exaggeration, some of the happiest in the young woman's life. Unfortunately, they turned out to be her last. Smith, along with her classmates, attended parties celebrating the end of high school. She had a great time, fully enjoying the festive atmosphere as well as romantic dates with her beloved. At this point, she'd achieved everything she had wished for: admission into her dream college, a relationship with a worthy young man who was about to propose, and it seemed a long, happy life lay ahead of her. The disappearance from the mall parking lot. On June 2, 2007, Kelsey and John were preparing to celebrate a significant milestone in their relationship, the 6-month anniversary of when they first started dating. John planned to make the day even more memorable by proposing to Kelsey. He had a beautiful engagement ring custom made for the occasion, reserved a table for 2 at a restaurant, and the evening was set to be one of the happiest in their lives together. Kelsey was unaware of the upcoming proposal, which was meant to be a surprise. She, too, was looking for a gift to surprise and delight John. That Saturday, she styled her hair, did her makeup, dressed up, and drove her car to a Target Corporation store located just 10 minutes from her home. There was no indication of the tragedy that was about to unfold. Around 7 in the evening, she called her mother to say she had found a gift for John but needed to find the perfect gift bag for it, preferably something with a romantic touch. Missy suggested checking a shopping mall across the street from Target, confident that it would have what Kelsey was looking for. Kelsey thanked her mother for the advice and said she would be home soon, where John was supposed to pick her up at 8 o'clock. That was the last time Missy heard her daughter's voice. Kelsey never made it back home. When John arrived at 8 with a large bouquet of flowers, he was shocked and frightened to find that Kelsey was not there. Her parents were equally terrified, as it was completely out of character for her not to answer phone calls or texts. She vanished in broad daylight in a busy area, and no one noticed her disappearance. Search and investigation. The family patriarch, along with his 2 eldest children, set out to search for their daughter. Upon finding her car parked at the Oak Park Mall, a sliver of hope emerged that Kelsey might still be inside the mall for some unknown reason. However, after searching through all the floors and stores and inquiring with the salespeople and security guards if anyone had seen the girl, they were convinced she was not there. Returning to the car, which appeared undisturbed without any signs of struggle or violence, the father, leveraging his experience as a former police officer, decided not to touch anything. It was possible the car was part of a crime scene, and it was crucial not to tamper with or destroy any evidence. The girl's parents reported her missing to the police that same day, but were initially met with resistance to start an immediate search. The explanation was that since Kelsey was 18, she wouldn't legally be considered missing until 24 hours had passed since her disappearance. However, Kelsey's father, not one to back down and using his old connections, insisted on an immediate search for his daughter. Moreover, he made inquiries to see if any hospitals in the city had admitted women matching their daughter's description. Kelsey's family and fiancé were interviewed that same evening to establish their alibis and rule them out as suspects, a standard procedure. Surveillance footage from the Target store was also reviewed. The videos showed Kelsey entering the store, browsing the selection, making a purchase, and then, while talking on the phone, leaving the building to head back to her car. At that moment, she was speaking with her mother, asking where to find a gift bag, and then headed to the mall across the street following her mother's advice. Essentially, Kelsey simply drove out, turned around, and parked at the Oak Park Mall, leaving her car near the side entrance almost against the wall. Her car was thoroughly inspected by experts. It seemed untouched from the outside. The gift she bought for John was on the passenger seat, and her backpack with personal items, a tablet, and a wallet containing about $300 in cash was in the back. Therefore, a robbery was quickly ruled out. It appeared that the car's owner had left only with her credit card and phone in her pocket, as everything else remained inside the car. No signs of a struggle, blood, or damage were found. There were no foreign fingerprints except for one found on the driver's seatbelt. This fingerprint belonged to neither Kelsey, her relatives, nor her boyfriend. Issues with the cellular company tracking the young woman's location could have been possible through the signal of her mobile phone. By that time, the device itself had become inaccessible, presumably turned off or damaged, but it was still feasible to determine the last known location where the mobile phone was active in order to narrow down the search area. However, Verizon Communications, the wireless carrier, did not provide the necessary data for the investigation for several days. Interestingly, the company did not outright refuse to cooperate but kept promising to look into the matter, effectively dragging out the process. Back in 2007, telecommunications companies were allowed to withhold subscriber data from law enforcement agencies, including the police or FBI, without a specific court order. They cited information privacy laws, and even situations where an individual's safety or life might be at risk were not considered exceptions to this rule. The disturbing stranger. Upon closer examination of the surveillance footage, a chilling detail was uncovered. A mysterious stranger following the young woman like a shadow. He didn't stand out at first because he always kept his distance and didn't attempt to interact with Kelsey directly. The individual in question was a Caucasian male with a pleasant appearance, estimated to be in his early to mid-20s, sporting dark, short hair and a light beard. He was dressed casually in a plain white t-shirt and black shorts. He entered the Target store roughly half a minute after the girl and followed her through all the sections she visited, maintaining a few meters distance. This mysterious man was captured by all the surveillance cameras that Kelsey was, and later during the trial, the prosecution would describe his behavior as akin to a predator stalking its prey. He exited the store after her and, making sure she was alone, followed her to the Oak Park parking lot in his Chevrolet truck. It's likely that he overheard her conversation with her mother, as he was practically behind Kelsey while she was on the phone. Consequently, he could have learned about her plans to visit the neighboring shopping center. Unfortunately, Smith parked her car in a poorly chosen spot next to a side door near a storage area where shadows fell on her vehicle, making it nearly impossible to discern the events on the camera footage. While Kelsey was still seated in her car, the truck parked beside her and a figure in a white t-shirt and black shorts emerged. The stranger approached her from the driver's side door, and then she, presumably under the threat of harm, got behind the wheel of his Chevrolet, and the truck drove off in an unknown direction. Media attention and alert viewers. From the outset, largely thanks to the connections and experience of Gregory Smith, the media were enlisted to cover the investigation. Smith knew that the louder the outcry, the broader the coverage in the press, and the more attention it garnered, the higher the chances of finding their daughter and bringing the responsible party to justice. The story was covered not only in national, but also in international media, including on the popular show America's Most Wanted. When surveillance footage revealed the mysterious stranger following Kelsey, the frame showing his face most clearly were broadcasted in the news, urging people to come forward if they recognized the man. That same evening, the police began receiving calls from individuals claiming to have seen the man in various cities and even states. Although most of these reports were mistaken, each one was investigated. On June 6th, a Mrs. Migas called in stating she recognized her neighbor, Edwin Hall, in the footage, but had hesitated to report it initially due to doubt. However, seeing the information about the truck removed her last doubts, as Hall also drove an old 1970s Chevrolet. Horrific discovery at Longview Lake and suspect's arrest. On June 6, 2007, several pivotal events unfolded in the investigation. First, crucial data regarding the last known location of Kelsey's phone signal was finally obtained from Verizon Communications. A specific cell tower was pinpointed, establishing a search radius of 1.1 miles to the north of it. Within 45 minutes of initiating the search operation, the lifeless body of the young woman was found in the brush near Longview Lake, Missouri, approximately 30 miles from where she was abducted. The medical examiners determined that Kelsey had been brutally assaulted and then strangled with her own belt. Her body was discovered without clothing, except for the belt used to strangle her around her neck. After the assault, her body was callously discarded in the bushes, covered only slightly with dry branches. Over the 4 days it lay exposed under the June sun, her remains were severely disfigured by insects and other wildlife, making them almost unrecognizable. Nonetheless, the examination confirmed that it was indeed the missing young Smith. The second significant event on June 6th was the arrest of the main suspect. When the police arrived at the man's residence, he was completely calm, acknowledged that his friends called him Jack, and agreed to provide a statement at the station. During the interrogation, he identified himself as Edwin Hall. Presented with a photograph of Kelsey, he claimed never to have seen her before. Even when shown surveillance footage from the store showing him following her closely, he insisted he had merely visited Target for personal reasons and hadn't noticed her, suggesting their appearance together in the footage was merely a bizarre coincidence. Irrefutable evidence. Edwin was evidently confident that he had left no trace behind and could not be held accountable. His van was clean. He had assaulted the victim using contraception, leaving no DNA evidence. Therefore, Hall agreed to cooperate with the investigation and even volunteered to provide his DNA sample and fingerprints. Crucially, his thumbprint matched the one found on the victim's car's seat belt buckle, becoming a pivotal piece of evidence. Furthermore, during a thorough search of the suspect's home, a hidden air pistol was found with Kelsey's DNA traces on the barrel. Hall was then officially charged with the abduction, assault, and termination of the young woman's life. Since Smith was abducted in Kansas but her lifeless body was discovered in Missouri, there arose a question regarding the jurisdiction of the trial. This detail was significantly important as it affected the potential sentence. In Missouri, the perpetrator faced the possibility of capital punishment. Trial and sentence Hall, realizing the gravity of his situation and after consulting with his attorney, decided to fully admit his guilt and disclose the details and circumstances of the crime in hopes of receiving a lesser sentence. He recounted how he noticed Kelsey as she entered the store and followed her. Indeed, he was close enough to overhear her phone conversation, learning she planned to visit the shopping center across the street. Edwin made sure Smith was alone, followed her to the adjacent parking lot, and was pleased when she parked in a secluded spot near the side entrance. He then emerged from his vehicle armed with a pistol, waited for the victim to return to her car, and prevented her from closing the door as she was getting into the driver's seat. Apparently, she had already pulled out the seatbelt, but he didn't allow her to buckle up, leaving his print on it in the process. Next, he placed the pistol barrel in the unfortunate girl's mouth, coercing her to move to his vehicle's driver's seat under threat. Smith drove Hall's truck while he aimed the weapon at her and instructed where to go. Upon reaching a remote area at the state border, he ordered her out of the truck and led her into the bushes. There, he assaulted her, strangled her with the belt, and covered her body with branches. He meticulously cleaned his truck's cabin to remove any fingerprints, DNA, or other traces of the victim's presence and hid the pistol with Kelsey's saliva at his home, confident it would never be found. When asked about his motive, he couldn't provide a clear explanation, but indifferently commented on her fantastic legs. Additionally, during the investigation, several other women and girls victimized by Hall's actions came forward. As a result, charges of corruption of a minor harassment and theft were added to the existing accusations. Hall's lawyer attempted to appeal to the court's sympathy, highlighting his client's troubled childhood, past victimhood, lack of parental care, and upbringing in foster homes. The defense's efforts were in vain, but the lawyer was the only person to speak on the defendant's behalf and support him. Hall's wife was present at all court hearings but sat quietly in a corner refusing to defend her husband. On September 16, 2008, Johnson County's judge sentenced Edwin Roy Hall to 27 life sentences without the possibility of parole. After hearing the verdict, the defendant apologized to the Smith family for his actions and then broke down in tears. He is currently serving his sentence at the Hutchinson Correctional Facility in Kansas. The Kelsey Smith Act. The role of Verizon Communications in this case, which hesitated for 4 days to provide data regarding the last known location of the missing girl's phone signal, drew significant attention. The company's leadership cited privacy laws and the absence of a court order, the issuance of which would take time. Although it was later determined that this information wouldn't have saved young Smith, in other situations, it could help preserve the lives and health of individuals in danger. This led to the enactment of the Kelsey Smith Act by Kansas in 2009, mandating telecommunications companies to provide subscriber location information when there is a risk of death or serious physical harm to the individual. An additional 29 states, including Missouri by 2012, adopted similar legislation. In 2021, Oklahoma, Montana, and Illinois also passed the Kelsey Smith Act. Since its enactment, this law has helped save many lives. For instance, in 2015 in Lenexa, Kansas, when a perpetrator stole a car with a child in a car seat, the police were able to locate him within half an hour by tracking the signal from the mobile phone left on the back seat by the child's mother. In 2021 in Illinois, a similar method was used to find a young woman who attempted to end her life by jumping off a cliff. She survived, albeit with significant injuries, but the prompt tracking of her phone signal led to her rescue. Interestingly, the Smith family never requested the law to be named after their deceased daughter. The idea came from Kansas Senator Rob Olson. Following their tragedy, the girl's family established a foundation to assist crime victims and continues to raise awareness among young people about safety issues. The Irene Cortez case, an unfortunate accident or a contracted murder of a mother of many. They say a scorned woman is capable of unpredictable and desperate acts, with cold and cruel revenge being the most fearsome. But what about a scorned man? Many would say an offended man might resort to physical violence, drown his sorrows in alcohol, or combine these two scenarios. Yet men, generally less grudge-holding, can be more ingenious when it comes to revenge. The case of Irene Cortez, a Spanish citizen who met a mysterious end during a trip to Colombia, is complex and ambiguous. While her perpetrators were caught, convicted, and are currently serving long sentences, the deceased woman's family claims the real culprit remains at large and is portraying himself as a victim. Let's delve into this intricate story from the beginning and try to determine if a third party was involved or if the murder was indeed unintentional. It's worth noting that each party involved is still trying to prove their version of the truth. Who was Irene Cortez? Irene Cortez, born Lucas, was born in 1980 in sunny Granada, Spain, the capital of the province of the same name. She grew up in a well-off family with a brother and sister. Her parents ran a small but profitable business. According to some reports, her father passed away early, but her mother, Maria Lucas, took over the business operations, expanded the enterprise, and ensured her children lacked for nothing. Maria's older brother, Uncle Pedro Lucas, was also a significant help. Irene was the eldest of the 3 children. A beautiful and sociable girl, she loved being the center of attention and attracted boys from an early age. Shortly after finishing school, she married and was already pregnant. At 17, she became a mother for the first time, and 2 years later, she had her second child. Her mother and uncle provided considerable support, allowing her to pursue a good education despite early motherhood. In the early 2000s, Irene moved to the resort city of Malaga with her husband and 2 children. There, she opened an entertainment venue that quickly became popular and profitable. Initially a small disco bar, it eventually transformed into a full-fledged nightclub. In Malaga, the couple welcomed their 3rd child, and life seemed prosperous and stable. At 25, Irene's husband was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison for trafficking illegal substances. Tragically, he lost his life in prison under mysterious circumstances. The responsibility of raising the children fell solely on Irene's shoulders. Remembering how her mother single-handedly raised 3 children, Irene was determined to persevere. She successfully managed her business, earned well, and had big plans for the future. Relationship with Farid Hennaceres. Farid Hennaceres, a native of Barranquilla, Colombia, was born in 1976. Growing up in a large, impoverished family, he was the youngest of his siblings. His parents separated in the early 90s when he was still a teenager. His older siblings were independent by then, and Farid stayed with his mother. In 2001, at 25, Farid, along with his elderly mother, moved to Spain in search of a better life. They settled in Malaga, where Farid took any job he could to support himself and his mother. In 2005, he started working as a waiter at a nightclub owned by Irene. Irene immediately noticed Farid's hard work and reliability. She was also attracted to him, and Farid, in turn, did his best to please her. At the time, Irene's husband was incarcerated, and she planned to file for divorce but couldn't before her husband's untimely demise. Irene and Farid's employer-employee relationship soon blossomed into romance. Farid wasn't deterred by Irene's 3 children from previous relationships, nor was Irene bothered by Farid's humble background as a waiter whose salary she paid. Within months of starting their relationship, the couple decided to move in together. They settled in Irene's spacious apartment, and soon after, Irene became pregnant with Farid's child. They went on to have 2 children together. It's unclear if they were officially married, but Irene kept her first husband's surname, while the children born with Farid carried the Hennaceres surname. Imprisonment and infidelity. In 2009, Irene's past seemed to repeat itself. Like her first husband, Farid was arrested for distributing illegal substances and sent to prison. Once again, Iran was left alone, this time with 5 children. Farid was sentenced to 3 years, but served only 1.5, being released early for good behavior and cooperation with the investigation. However, soon after Farid's imprisonment, Irene found solace in the arms of another man and lived with him for those 1.5 years. Farid learned of her infidelity only after his release. Understandably furious, he threatened Irene and her lover and almost attacked the man, narrowly avoiding another legal issue. Eventually, they resolved the matter peacefully. Farid forgave Irene for the sake of their children, and they resumed living together as if there had been no imprisonment or infidelity. Irene's relatives were always skeptical about Farid. Her mother and uncle disapproved of their relationship, suspecting Farid was only interested in Irene's money. Also, Irene's older children from her first marriage never accepted Farid, while the youngest, whom Farid had raised since the child was 2, saw him as a father figure. Fateful trip to Colombia. In early 2011, Irene's husband, Farid, expressed the need to visit his homeland of Colombia due to his father's severe illness. Reportedly, Farid's estranged father was diagnosed with advanced cancer, and his sister in Barranquilla had informed him of the dire situation. Irene, who had long wished to visit Farid's homeland, decided to accompany him. She was eager to meet Farid's father, whom she had never met, and also experience the legendary Barranquilla Carnival, typically held in late February. Moreover, Irene, who hadn't taken a vacation for years due to her dedication to work and raising her 5 children, saw this trip as an opportunity for a much-needed break. The couple planned a 10-day trip across the ocean, with Irene's mother and younger sister agreeing to care for her children during this period. Despite her mother, Maria Lucas' attempts to dissuade her from the journey due to a bad premonition, Irene disregarded her concerns. At the same time, the family faced financial difficulties due to a seasonal downturn in their business. Despite this, Irene had personal savings of 3,000 euros in cash hidden at home. But on the eve of their trip, she discovered the money had mysteriously vanished, almost derailing their plans. Irene quickly borrowed the necessary funds from her uncle and close friends. She also booked their flight tickets and a hotel in the city center, thoroughly preparing for a journey that, tragically, would be her last. Mysterious murder. On February 27, 2011, the couple arrived in Colombia. The flight was uneventful, and they immediately checked into their hotel. Irene called home to reassure her mother. However, 2 days later, Farid informed Irene's eldest son, 14, of his mother's death. Initially, Farid claimed an accident, but it was soon revealed that Irene was murdered during a robbery at a Barranquilla entertainment venue. The case quickly became a major news story in Colombia. The narrative was that Irene, a Spanish tourist, was killed by robbers who fled the scene, triggering a citywide policeman hunt. However, the circumstances of the robbery and murder seemed unusual and suspicious. The attackers did not appear to be trying to steal anything, but instead shot Irene in the heart and then fled in haste. Police and local media representatives quickly arrived on the scene. Despite the fact that Farid witnessed the shooting of his partner during an interview with journalists, he looked quite calm, not corresponding to the image of a grief-stricken widower. The Spanish embassy in Bogotá confirmed the murder, adding that Irene's remains will be repatriated after the necessary investigations. The exact events of the night of March 2nd have yet to be clarified by investigators. In the meantime, authorities are actively pursuing the attackers responsible for this senseless crime. Surveillance footage. The case of Irene Cortez's mysterious death seemed to gain clarity after reviewing surveillance footage from cameras installed at the location where the murder occurred. On March 1st, Irene and her partner, Farid Janissaires, had planned to meet Farid's brother, his sister, and their spouses. The group of 6 enjoyed the carnival, walked around town, and then, at Farid's suggestion, went to a local bar for dinner and entertainment. By 1 a.m., Irene, Farid, and his relatives were the only customers at the bar, as surveillance footage clearly shows. Around 2 a.m., 2 young men sitting away from the group entered the bar. They did not order anything and did not look comfortable, which caught the attention of the bar manager because of their suspicious behavior. Moreover, their young appearance made the manager check whether they were of legal age. The young men refused to show their IDs, and when asked to leave, one of them pulled out a gun and aimed it at the manager. His accomplice produced a knife, but soon retreated out of the camera's view. The armed assailant pushed the manager aside and approached Irene's table, announcing a robbery and demanding mobile phones and cash. His knife-wielding partner reappeared, presumably to collect valuables, while the gunman kept the group under threat. However, he didn't get a chance to act. Confronting Irene, the gunman ordered Farid to stand for a pocket search. As Irene reached for her purse, the assailant lunged at her with the same hand holding the gun. A shot was fired as he grabbed the purse, striking Irene directly in the chest. She collapsed to the floor as the assailants fled without taking anything. Farid and his brother chased after them while his sister tried to stop Irene's bleeding and his brother's wife called for emergency services. Unfortunately, the culprits were too fast to catch. The men returned to the bar attempting to aid Irene, but it was too late. Emergency responders arrived quickly, Yet Irene succumbed to her injuries en route to the hospital, leaving behind a baffling case and a grieving family. The hunt for the perpetrators, arrest, and trial. In the wake of the robbery and homicide that took Irene Cortez's life, law enforcement mobilized all available resources. The city was teeming with tourists for the carnival, and ensuring their safety was paramount. A reward of £10 million, about €3,500, was announced for information leading to the culprits. The first suspect, the gunman Brian Dario, was apprehended the next day. He quickly implicated his accomplice, Juan Carlos. 118 surrendered to authorities, hoping for leniency. During interrogation, Dario claimed dire financial straits, debts, and a sick child in need of costly treatment drove him to the crime, corroborated later by his relatives. He maintained that Irene's shooting was accidental, occurring while trying to snatch her purse. Juan Carlos contended he was an unwitting participant. He said Brian didn't reveal his plans but asked for backup in a job. He claimed to have only a small knife for intimidation, not harm, and left the scene once he realized Brian's intentions. However, surveillance footage contradicted his claims, showing him returning to Brian. With both perpetrators in custody and their confessions, the case appeared solved, with prison sentences looming. The court found Dario guilty of robbery and homicide under aggravating circumstances, sentencing him to 23 years. Carlos received 17 years for complicity in these crimes. Accusations against Farid and new crime details. From the early stages of the investigation, the family of the deceased woman openly accused Farid of orchestrating the murder of his wife. Irene's mother and uncle hired a detective who conducted an independent investigation, gathering additional materials and evidence to hold the man accountable and prove his involvement in the crime, starting with the earlier mentioned disappearance of €3,000 from the hiding place in Cortez's house. According to Maria Lucas, only Farid knew about this money, and he was the only one who could have discreetly taken it. The woman told her daughter about this from the beginning, but she did not want to listen. Now, she believed that her son-in-law used this money to pay Dario to kill his wife. Another weighty argument was the fabricated illness of the man's father, whom he was so eager to visit. It turned out that no cancer diagnosis was made for the elderly parent, and he was quite healthy for his age. Farid concocted this story, making it the main pretext for the trip to Colombia. Also, it was Janissaires who initiated the visit to that fateful establishment. Moreover, he insisted on continuing the feast deep into the night when all the other visitors had long dispersed, and their company was alone in the hall. Further, the detective conducted a detailed analysis of those very recordings from the cameras, giving an assessment of what was happening and making his own conclusions. He noticed that the criminals acted strangely. Juan was clearly scared and most likely really did not understand what was happening while Brian approached the company, came up to Farid and raised him, but did not directly threaten him with a gun. It looked like the men knew each other and acted cohesively. Then Farid strangely moved behind Irene, who was sitting at the table. When she reached into her bag to get her wallet, the criminal with the gun looked at the man as if waiting for a signal. It's hard to say exactly whether he received any kind of sign, as the victim and her husband were back to the camera. After the shot, the man chased the killer, but in the expert's opinion, he deliberately let him escape. However, the latter statement can be considered controversial, as Brian was armed with a gun and Farid could reasonably fear for his life. Also in question was the man's behavior after his chosen one was declared dead. He willingly gave interviews to the arrived correspondents, talked about the details of what happened, and at the same time did not look too upset or depressed. Another important question: why after the tragedy did Janissaires call not Irene's mother, not her uncle or any of the adult relatives, but dialed the number of her 14-year-old son to tell him about his mother's death? According to Maria Lucas, he wanted to personally inflict pain on the teenager, punishing him for not recognizing the stepfather's authority and treating him disrespectfully. The woman's uncle was the first to dare to give an interview in the press and openly talk about his suspicions and the results of the investigation. Pedro Lucas was sure that Farid planned the trip in advance, essentially luring Irene into a trap. The money stolen from her was used to pay for the services of a hired killer, and after her death, he planned to establish guardianship over the children and take over the business of his deceased wife. Farid's mother did not silently listen to her son being accused of a terrible crime and openly stood up for her offspring. The woman claimed that her offspring was madly in love with Irene and her children and would never harm her. However, in the end, the parent inadvertently let slip a phrase about the chosen one not having to cheat on Farid, as this greatly offended his pride. Also, an unpleasant detail emerged about Janissaires leaving Spain on fake documents, as he was not allowed to leave the country because he had recently been released from prison on parole. The man himself denied this information, stating that he left legally, and Irene acted as his guarantor. Funeral. Without the widower. 12 days after the tragedy, Irene's body was returned to her native Spain. The funeral was conducted with a closed casket, as the remains had begun to decompose after such an extended period. 100 attended the funeral. Family, friends, neighbors, and even those who didn't personally know Cortez, but had heard about the resonant story and wanted to express their condolences to the family. The only person missing from the farewell ceremony was Farid, who simply feared returning from Colombia, apprehensive of retribution. Farid claimed that the relatives of his late wife had repeatedly threatened him and his elderly mother. For this reason, before flying back to Spain, he intended to appeal to the authorities to ensure his safety. He sought a protective order to be able to attend the funeral, but his request was denied, and Janissaires decided not to take the risk. In turn, Farid filed a complaint in court against the relatives of his deceased wife, who he alleged hindered his return home. However, Maria and Pedro Lucas denied his claims, stating they were most interested in his return to face trial in Spain. Additional court proceedings. With new circumstances and accusations against Farid, an additional investigation and court proceedings were conducted. Dario and Carlos, already serving their sentences in a Colombian prison, were interrogated about their acquaintance with Janissaires and a possible premeditated conspiracy. However, Brian categorically denied this assumption. He continued to insist that the murder was an accidental result of a failed robbery attempt. He claimed he had never seen Farid before, let alone been hired as a hitman for his wife. The accusations indeed seemed to be grasping at straws, with no irrefutable evidence of premeditation or a contract killing, only assumptions and interpretations of the events on the recording. Dario also confessed that he was under the influence of alcohol and prohibited substances that evening. Hence, his poor recollection of the event's chronology. As for Carlos, he maintained that his friend did not involve him in his plans, and everything that happened in the bar was as shocking to him as it was to those they attacked. Blon appeared to be telling the truth, but Brian's words, "who made the fatal shot," raised some doubts. Consider this. He failed to commit the robbery, ended up in prison, but his sick child still received the necessary expensive treatment. Brian claimed that kind-hearted people learning about his motive helped him. However, the Lucas family's lawyers tried to prove that the 3,000 euros stolen from Irene, which Farid paid for her murder, were spent on the treatment. Supposedly, Brian agreed to sacrifice himself and go to prison to save his child and secretly pass the money to his wife. This version, however, was never proven. Returned to Spain. Only after obtaining a court order that guaranteed his safety did Janissaires decide to return to Spain. Several months had passed since the tragedy, and the media frenzy had subsided. Upon his return, Janissaires claimed to have brought investigation materials proving his innocence in his wife's murder. He cited his main reason for returning as a desire to care for the children he shared with Irene, who had been under the care of the deceased's relatives during his absence. 6 months later, Farid decided to give a major interview in which he revealed that he had lost virtually everything. He was jobless. His passport had been annulled, preventing him from leaving the country. And to add insult to injury, his friends had turned their backs on him, and the mother and uncle of his late wife forbade him from seeing his children. Janissaires repeatedly faced Maria and Pedro Lucas in court. He accused them of threatening him while they attempted to prove his involvement in Irene's murder. However, neither side could substantiate their claims. Ultimately, the children remained in the custody of their grandmother and uncle, and the widower was unable to claim any of his late wife's property. The case of Sarai Sierra. She went across the ocean to meet her death. The high-profile case of an American girl photographer named Sarai Sierra 10 years ago stirred the world and brought the intelligence services of two countries located on different continents to their feet. The U.S. citizen disappeared without a trace during her photo tour in Istanbul, as if vanishing into thin air. This story was widely covered in the press, and the situation and circumstances were so strange that it gave rise to a lot of rumors and conspiracy theories. Despite active, large-scale, and timely searches, it was unfortunately not possible to find the girl alive. Her body was found in the historic center of the city, near the walls of Saraburnu. But how did it happen that, in a white day in a popular tourist spot, so simply took a person's life and no one even noticed it? To understand this case, it is necessary to restore the whole chain of events that led to this tragedy, and now we will try to do it together. Sarai Sierra was born on November 9, 1979, in New York City, the second child in a large family. Raised alongside her older brother David and younger sister Christina, Sarai's parents, Dennis and Bethany Syme Jimenez, were of Puerto Rican descent. They emigrated to the United States in 1973, settling in Manhattan, where they became active members of a local Protestant community. As evangelical Christians, the couple instilled strict religious values in their children, who were brought up to adhere to the canons of their adopted faith. The Jimenez family was deeply involved in church activities, attending services regularly and engaging with their community. The children also attended Sunday school as part of their upbringing. Sarai stood out as a creative and active individual with a strong-willed yet complex personality. Unlike her younger sister Christina, who was quiet, modest, and obedient, Sarai was viewed as a rebellious and mischievous child. Despite her spirited nature, she maintained a deep respect for her parents and recognized their authority within the household, where strict rules governed daily life. This applied to the daily routine of its inhabitants, many everyday moments, as well as norms of behavior. For example, the daughters were not allowed to socialize with boys, go on dates, or be out of the house after 9 o'clock in the evening. All their friendly contacts were controlled, and parents always knew where and with whom their children were. In fact, Sarai's entire life revolved around home, school, and church, and her social circle was limited to the people in those places. The active, energetic, socially oriented girl was bored and cramped within the framework in which she was kept, but her parents were sure that they were doing the right thing for the good of their children. During her school years, Sarai planned to enter a pedagogical university and become a teacher in the field of culture or arts. But closer to the end of her studies, she became interested in psychology and began to think about connecting her future profession with this field of activity. During one of the meetings of the religious community, slender, dark-haired beauty attracted the attention of a young man named Stephen Sierra. He was the first to approach her and made an excuse to talk to her. Sarai was barely 18 years old at the time, and her new acquaintance was 7 years older than her. But despite the age difference, with the approval of their parents, the young people began dating. Stephen immediately liked Dennis and Bethany, who thought that this decent, polite, and honest young man would be a good match for their daughter. Most likely, Sarai was not madly in love with the guy, but agreed to marry him, mostly for the sake of finally moving out of her parents' house and freeing herself from such tight control. It should be noted that Sarai had a good relationship with her parents, but she wanted some freedom to live her own life and plan her own future. Less than a year after meeting, in February 1999, the couple got married. The bride was 19 years old at the time, and the groom was 26 years old. Soon after, the couple moved to the state of Michigan, where Stephen's parents lived. For Sarai, this move was a real event because before that, she spent all her conscious life practically without staying in his native New York. The change of scenery did her good, and in a new place, she seemed to revitalize. Sarai enjoyed shopping for things for her new home, making it cozy, enjoying new acquaintances and new places. She got a job at a local dental office as a receptionist and was thinking about getting a college degree after all. However, Sarai soon became pregnant and had children, first a boy and then a girl. Entry into the university had to be postponed because the young woman was completely absorbed in motherhood and enjoyed it. A couple of years later, the family Sierra with 2 children again decided to move. And this time, they went to sunny California, settling in the picturesque neighborhood of Silver Lake in Los Angeles. Here, Stephen was offered a job, but soon the couple realized that the money he was earning, they do not have enough to live on. Then, having consulted, they decided to return back to New York and settled in a modest rented apartment located near the house of the Jimenez family. At that time, the couple faced serious financial problems. Sarai was still at home with the children, and her husband had to survive on casual income, because of which they periodically had to get into debt. The situation began to change for the better when the children went to school and the young mother got a job at an advertising agency. Stephen had by then found a permanent job as a bus driver on one of the city routes, a new hobby. Closer to 30 years, when the children have already grown up and life stabilized, Sarai again remembered her long-standing plans to get a higher education. By that time, she was not interested in the pedagogical faculty at all, and Sarai chose the faculty of and choose an occupation that would be to her liking, inspire her, and allow her to express herself. Since Sarai had always been a creative person, good at drawing and seeing the beauty in everything, she became interested in photography and soon joined a well-known New York photography community to be able to develop in this direction. She was widely recognized as having a real talent. Sarai was able to choose the right angles and harmoniously build compositions, making incredible in its beauty shots. Even professionals praised her work for her creativity and vision. In early 2012, on the advice of her colleagues, Sarai created a page in one of the popular social networks where she began to post her work. The success did not take long, and other users began to subscribe to the young woman's profile by the 1,000, enthusiastically commenting on each of her works. In a few months, she became a real star, and the number of her subscribers continued to grow exponentially. Such a furor literally dizzy her head. Sarai felt that she could achieve more, that she wanted to develop and improve in this direction. So she made a proposal to organize a group photo tour in search of beautiful and unusual locations in different parts of the world. Sarai Sierra started with small trips around her native country, specializing in shooting architectural ensembles and various historical monuments. Her images were a great success, and she decided not to stop. Sarai wanted to travel to Istanbul, one of the most ancient and beautiful cities in the world, to capture its sights and historical sites. It should be noted that her parents were not thrilled with this idea because she had never left the country before and never left home for so long. But Sarai was adamant. In addition, she had to be accompanied on the trip by her best friend Magdalena. As it turned out, Sarai's family was in crisis, and her relationship with her husband was falling apart. Perhaps part of the reason for her idea of a photo tour on the other side of the world was a desire to get away, change her surroundings, and reflect on what was happening in her family from a distance. Sarai had lived in a strict framework for too long, and now she was eager to do something she wanted to do, something her soul demanded. During that period, her husband's social media account began to show strange postings and statuses. He philosophized about the value of marriage, about love and mutual respect between husband and wife, and also noted that he would not cheat on his other half even if the marriage hangs in the balance. In one of the posts, Stephen opaquely hinted that his spouse was unfaithful to him, but a few hours later, he deleted the publication, leaving the questions that appeared under it unanswered. Stephen obviously didn't feel happy and loved and tried to show it to everyone through his social media page. Sarai was experiencing similar torment but kept it to herself, trying not to complain and focus on her creativity, the long-awaited trip. Shortly before the planned tour, Sarai learned that her best friend would not be able to travel with her because of problems at work. The young woman was very upset, but did not change her plans because she had been going to it for too long. Sarai's relatives were concerned about the fact that she would fly alone to a foreign country across the ocean, but she assured them that everything would be fine, promising to call, write, and send photos every day. In addition, Sarai was also planning to visit Germany and Austria, where she had several commercial photography assignments already scheduled. Her entire trip was literally scheduled by the hour, and she was not going to deviate from the schedule. On January 7, 2013, a young American woman boarded a flight from New York to Istanbul. She was carrying a small amount of cash, a smartphone, a tablet, a fairly inexpensive DSLR camera, and several lenses designed for professional photography. Upon arrival, Sarai called her family, informing them that she had arrived safely and was on her way to check into the hotel she had booked in advance. It should be noted that she had a rather modest budget, so she had to stay in a remote area, which the locals considered unsafe. After leaving her things in the room and changing her clothes from the road, Sarai Sierra immediately went to the nearest metro station to get to the historic city center. She wandered the streets of Istanbul until nightfall, photographing its beauty and savoring every shot she took. In the evenings, she would call her parents and husband via video call, sharing her impressions and her plans for the next day. She would also process fresh shots and post them to her social media accounts. New friend. As it later turned out, Sarai was accompanied in Istanbul by a young man named Thailand. They met on social networks in the middle of 2012, and it was Thailand who convinced the American to fly to Turkey. For several months, they actively corresponded and became very close during this time. Sarai completely trusted her new acquaintance. They saw each other almost every day and together visited various attractions. The guy was a native of Istanbul, so he knew the city like the back of his hand and arranged for Sarai exciting excursions to the most interesting, sometimes unusual places. After a week's stay in Turkey, the photographer had a trip planned to a couple of European countries where, as I said, she arranged several commercial photo shoots. Here, Sarai saved money on hotel accommodation because she agreed to be hosted by her subscribers who had been following her work for a long time. These moments were negotiated and agreed in advance. So at the airport in Vienna, she was met by a young man in whose house she stayed for a couple of days. The Austrian acquaintance was a few years older than Sarai. He himself was fond of photography and admired her works, so he was eager to communicate personally with such a talented photographer. The trip went according to plan. Sarai visited all the places she had planned and met everyone she had arranged to meet. On the third day, she flew to Berlin, where she was also met at the airport by her subscribers who gave her a tour of the city. After finishing all her business in Germany, the photographer went to the airport again and returned to Istanbul, where she planned to stay for 2 more days before returning home. Upon arrival, she was met by Taylan, with whom they spent the day driving around the city, and afterward, they went to a popular local bar together. It was after midnight when the Turk escorted Sarai to her hotel, where they said goodbye. A mysterious disappearance in a foreign country. On January 21st, 2013, the last day of her photo tour, Sarai called her parents and husband to let them know what time and what flight she was taking to New York. She had never been away from home for so long before, so everyone was happy that her trip was finally coming to an end. However, before leaving, Sarai decided to take one last walk around the city and take some more beautiful shots for her account. At the appointed time, Sarai's father arrived at the airport to pick up his daughter because her husband was at work and could not make it. He arrived early because he was afraid of getting stuck in traffic and not being on time. They announced the arrival of the plane. All the passengers got off, but Sarai was not among them. Her phone was also unavailable, and all attempts to contact her were futile. Then Dennis waited a little longer, and then, concerned about his daughter's absence, went to the representatives of the airline. However, Dennis was literally shocked when they informed him that a passenger with such a name had not boarded the aircraft. Dennis immediately called Stephen and informed him of what had happened, saying that it was necessary to immediately organize a search. Sarai's husband first contacted the hotel where his wife was staying in Istanbul, but there he was told that her belongings were still in the room and she had not checked out, although she should have done so yesterday, and did not appear in the hotel for the second day. This information caused a real panic among the family members because they did not know where Sarai was and did not understand how to proceed. Stephen, who had access to his wife's accounts, decided to check them, looking for some clues. There, he found his wife's correspondence with Thailand, which seemed very suspicious to him. Nevertheless, he decided to contact the Turk himself to find out what he knew. But Thailand claimed that he had seen the missing woman the day before the planned departure, and before the flight, she did not even call him, although she promised. Sarai's family immediately reported the incident to the American embassy in Turkey, and a day later, a large-scale search operation was organized on the spot, for which a special unit was even created. Almost immediately, Sarai's husband and parents flew to Istanbul, deciding that they needed to be personally involved in the search. Besides, not much time had passed since her disappearance, and there was a high probability of finding her alive. Investigating police officers. The first thing decided to determine the social circle of the American and talk to those who saw her shortly before she disappeared. To testify were called employees of the hotel where she stayed, as well as her friend, Tylen. The hotel manager stated that he last saw Miss Sierra the night before she left. She was leaving with a small bag and a camera in hand. She was supposed to check out later, but never showed up at the hotel again. And the next morning, they received a call from her worried husband, who informed them that Sarai's belongings and documents were still at the hotel. The receptionist also described the clothes Sarai was wearing that day. The situation with Tylen was much more interesting and ambiguous. First, the guy's name was actually Tarkan, and why he introduced himself to his new acquaintance with an assumed name was unclear. Secondly, they had been in close contact for several months before their meeting, and Sarai had arrived in Istanbul at his invitation. All of this suggested that there was a romantic relationship between them, but Tarkan himself categorically denied it, claiming that they were only friends. The next stage of the investigation was to recreate in as much detail as possible the route that Sarai took that day. For this purpose, her cell phone data was checked as well as street CCTV footage. Thus, it was established that the young woman took the subway to Sultanahmet district, visited the promontory between the Bosphorus Strait and the Golden Horn Bay, visited Eminonu Market. But there she was lost in a large crowd of tourists. Then her trail was retraced to the subway where she was going down to go to the Sarai Bernu walls, but she soon disappeared from the camera's view again. Frightening discovery. The searchers decided to go to the ruins of the Sarai Bernu walls to comb the area and interview people. Maybe someone remembered a lone woman with a camera in her hands. After several hours, the search was successful, if you can call it that. The body of a young woman if you can call it that. The body of a young woman with no signs of life was found near the ruins of the walls of ancient Constantinople. It was covered with an old dirty blanket, so it was not conspicuous. Investigators assumed that it was in this blanket that Sierra was brought here. Forensics believe the body had been there for about 10 to 12 days before it was found. There were no clothes on the lower part of the body, which immediately prompted a version of violence, which was later confirmed by experts. The autopsy revealed that Sierra died from a blow to the head with a blunt, heavy object. But there were also several hematomas on her body and a couple of ribs were broken. In addition, pathologists found particles of epithelium and blood under Sarai's fingernails, and this indicated that she had defended herself and scratched the perpetrator. The crime looked strange and even ridiculous because the victim's bag, smartphone, and camera were stolen. But at the same time, she was wearing gold earrings, wedding ring, and expensive watch, which immediately caught the eye. All that could be found on camera footage from the area was a young woman who looked like Sarai filming something on her phone. And then a man approached her, either hitting her or pushing her. And then they both disappeared from the camera's view. The attacker was not immediately identified. Versions and conspiracy theories. Almost instantly, the information was leaked to the media, almost provoking an international scandal. The whole point is that from the TV screens and from the pages of newspapers, every day appealed to people to help in the search for the missing American woman and tell if anyone knows anything. But at the same time, the investigation was silent. And when the body was discovered, the situation became even more confusing. Many people wondered why a young married woman suddenly flew alone across the ocean. What was she doing in Istanbul and Europe? And with what funds had she traveled there? It all looked suspicious indeed, and investigators initially thought that Sarai had gone to see her lover, Tylen, aka Tarkan, and afterward flew to another man in Austria. But both her buddies denied being intimate with the victim. Later, it turned out that the man who sheltered Sarai in Vienna has a criminal record, in connection with which there was a version that he could use the American as a drug courier. But a thorough check did not confirm this speculation. There were also rumors that Sarai could work for the U.S. intelligence services and to collect information in other countries. Allegedly, hence the money for intercontinental flights. This version looked untenable, so it was not even seriously considered. The investigation of this high-profile case was carried out by Turkish special services together with the FBI. But at first, they did not have any serious leads. Only a few weeks later, the police came to the alleged perpetrator, a previously convicted and unemployed guy named Tal Sali, collecting waste paper on the city streets. But it was not possible to communicate with him because almost immediately after the crime, he borrowed money from relatives and left the country, presumably going to Hati province where he illegally crossed the border with Syria. After obtaining a warrant, police searched the suspect's home where they took a sample of his DNA and compared it with skin particles and seminal fluid found on the body of the murdered woman. After that, the last doubts were dispelled. Tal Sali was the perpetrator of the crime. In addition, the victim's phone was last switched on in the neighborhood where he lived. When it became known that the criminal fled to Syria, the special services lost all hope of getting to him. But soon, fate itself gave them an unexpected surprise. This guy was detained while trying to cross the border illegally again, but this time he was trying to return to Turkey. He joined the rebels in Syria and obtained firearms, but was injured in the conflict and decided he would be safer at home. However, he made his way back with his weapon, which was the initial reason for his arrest. But the local police soon realized who was in their hands and immediately reported him to the security services. When Tal Sali was brought in for questioning, his story was literally discouraging with horrific details. He saw a young woman on a hiking trail along the walls of Saraburnu, and for a few minutes, he simply admired her and watched her taking pictures. When he got closer, Sarai tried to ask him something using gestures, but due to the language barrier, he never understood what she wanted. However, he noticed a brand new iPhone in her hands and an expensive camera around her neck. As Sarai walked on, he followed her, already determined to rob her. It was getting dark outside, and there were no other people near the wall, at least in sight. At one point, Sierra turned around and, as it seemed to him, took a picture of him. That action became a trigger of sorts. Tal Sali grabbed a boulder and lunged at Sierra, hitting her hard in the head. After that, they literally rolled together down to the ruins of the wall, hence probably bruises and broken ribs on Sarai's body. Then Tal Sali, taking advantage of the unconsciousness of the victim, decided to commit violent acts of intimate nature. The perpetrator then delivered another severe blow to the head to finish Sarai off. Tal Sali took the victim's bag, her camera and phone, and walked away. On his way, he came across the same blanket that someone had thrown away and decided to return to cover the victim's body with it. By that time, it was finally dark outside and the chances of meeting someone at the wall were minimal. Once back, the perpetrator dragged the body a little to the side, positioning it so that it would not be visible from the hiking path. He then covered it with a blanket and left. Surprisingly, while the search for the American woman was going on, the perpetrator visited the crime scene one more time to make sure Sarai was dead and her body was lying where he had left it. When Tal Sali learned from the news that his victim had been found, he realized that the police would quickly get on his trail, so he decided to flee the country, borrowing money from his sister who always felt sorry for him. By the way, he was never able to realize the stolen goods. The camera was broken in the process of falling. The smartphone had a password, which the criminal unsuccessfully tried to unravel while at home. Hence the signal and all the other stolen items he threw away when he went on the run. The defendant did not deny his guilt, and judging from his accounts, he did not regret what he had done, nor did he suffer from pangs of conscience. As key evidence, DNA forensic evidence was presented, which confirmed that it was his skin that was found under the fingernails of the murdered woman, and his seminal fluid was found on her body. Also, Sarai's cell phone was last switched on in the vicinity of his residence. In addition, the case file was supplemented with a video surveillance camera recording of the attack itself. After all the evidence was presented, it was decided that a psychiatric examination was necessary because of the belief that Tal Sali was insane. This idea was suggested by his actions, behavior, and the calmness with which he described in detail the atrocities he had committed. But experts concluded that he was sane and fully aware of his actions when he attacked his victim. In the summer of 2014, the judge effectively delivered the final verdict. Tal Sali was found guilty on all counts against him and sentenced to life imprisonment. Sarai's relatives considered this decision fair. The body of the murdered American woman, after all the necessary expert examinations, was transported to her homeland in New York, and all related costs were borne by a Turkish airline. Sarai was buried in compliance with all religious rites and traditions. Family members of the deceased created an internet site dedicated to her memory where they published her works, which had not appeared anywhere before. The photos were a great success, and people from different parts of the world were ready to buy them. The money received from the sale of Picturesque, the family saved for college education for orphan children Sarai. As for Stephen, he categorically denied that in his and his wife's family life was a crisis, which pushed the young woman on that fateful trip. Soon, Stephen became close to a girl from the Christian community who supported him in a difficult period and often came to his home to help him with his children and household chores. Donald Harvey, born on April 15, 1952, in Hamilton, Ohio, was the eldest of 3 children. His parents, Ray and Goldie Harvey, affectionately called him Donnie, a quiet boy with big brown eyes and curly hair. Shortly after his birth, the family relocated to Boonville, Kentucky, a small Appalachian community where Ray worked as a tobacco farmer and Goldie managed the household. The family struggled with extreme poverty, which strained Ray and Goldie's marriage, though they remained loving and attentive to their children. Donald was a reserved child, showing no apparent signs of abnormality in his early years. However, reports suggest that his troubled and traumatic past may have planted the seeds of his later sadistic tendencies. Between the ages of 4 and 20, Donald allegedly endured abuse from at least 3 men, including his maternal uncle, an older neighbor who offered him money at 18, and his roommate, Randy White. While such experiences cannot excuse his later crimes, they offer potential insight for psychologists and criminal profilers examining the roots of his actions. At school, Donald was a loner, rarely engaging in social activities or extracurriculars. Instead, he spent much of his time reading, further isolating himself from his peers. While this got him good grades, it also earned him a reputation for being the teacher's pets, which led to teasing. Following his graduation from Sturgeon Elementary School, Donald entered Boonville High School in 1968. Despite his good scores, he rapidly became bored with a daily routine, which prompted him to drop out. He later received a diploma from a correspondence school out of Chicago and got his GED the following year at the age of 16. Having no future aspirations, Donald didn't know what he would do with his life at this point. He eventually relocated to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he managed to secure a job at a local factory. Donald was doing well in this job until the work dried up at the plant in 1970, and he was eventually laid off. A few days later, his mother called him and asked him to travel to Kentucky and visit his ailing grandfather, who was recently placed in Nuringout Hospital in London, Kentucky. He had no idea that agreeing to his mother's request would forever change the course of his life. While visiting his ill grandfather every day, Donald formed a trusting bond with the hospital workers. In fact, they liked him so much that he was offered a job at the hospital. It was here that a terrifying journey of madness and mayhem began, which would go on to last nearly 20 years. Donald's true motive for wanting to work as a nurse's aide might not even be known. However, some people believe that he was desperate to earn money after losing his previous job. He was not a trained nurse or doctor, but the hospital staff had full faith in him. Donald's duties required him to spend hours along with patients, including changing bedpans, inserting catheters, and passing out medications. While looking after the patients was by no means an easy job, Donald's first few weeks at the hospital were uneventful. That is, until one incident with an elderly patient snapped something within him. A disturbing beginning to an unfathomable string of events. It was May 31st, 1970, and Donald was taking care of an 88-year-old stroke victim, Logan Evans. During an evening shift, he walked into a private room to check on the elderly patient, and Mr. Evans rubbed feces in Donald's face. Although the patient was most likely not in his right mind following a stroke, the incident angered Donald so much that he lost all control. The next thing he knew, he was smothering the elderly man with a blue plastic bag and a pillow. Once Evans was motionless, Donald listened to his heart rate with a stethoscope to make sure that he was dead. He then disposed of the plastic bag and cleaned them up, dressing them in a clean hospital gown and showering before notifying the nurses. After this incident, no eyebrows were raised and no questions were asked. As a predator who just got his first taste of blood, Donald's thirst for killing only grew. The very next day, he was looking after another elderly patient, 69-year-old James Tyree. Donald, it seems, used the wrong-sized catheter on him. Tyree initially let him proceed, but then yelled at him to take it out. Donald used the heel of his hand to control him until he'd vomited blood and died due to an air embolism. Again, no suspicions were raised. As no one detected foul play in his first two murders, Donald became more carefree. Just 3 weeks after committing his first murder, he cut off the oxygen tank of 42-year-old patient Elizabeth Wyatt. This was the beginning of his mercy kill, as he would call his killings later. He claimed he was aware that she was praying to die and even told him she wished she could die, so he killed her to end her suffering. For hours later, a nurse found her dead. Again, no one questioned Donald. Since no one at the hospital became suspicious, Donald saw this as an opportunity to unleash his inner monster. Over the next 10 months, 15 patients died under his care while working at the hospital. Be it pleasure or experimentation, the methods of each murder varied. Smothering, sabotaging oxygen tags, injecting lethal drugs, overdosing people with medication, it seems he would use almost anything to kill. When angered, his methods became more brutal. On one occasion, after an argument with a patient, Donald snuck into the patient's room and inserted a coat hanger through his catheter, puncturing his bladder and bowel. As a result of the puncture, infection set in and the man died a few days later. Despite this brutality, Donald always considered these killings to be merciful. The so-proclaimed angel of death wanted to play God with the lives of the vulnerable, cloaking his monstrosities in a warm blanket by giving them the title Mercy Killings. March 31st, 1971, exactly 1 year after his first murder, was the last day Donald worked at Marymount Hospital. That evening, he was arrested for a burglary he committed while drunk. In his drunken stupor, Donald incoherently confessed about the murders to the cops, but no one took him seriously. Donald ultimately placed charges of petty theft. Instead of serving prison time, he paid a hefty fine. Although Donald managed to remain free, this incident changed the course of his life for a brief time. For the next few months, Donald tried to get his life back in order and eventually found work as a part-time nurse's aide at Cardinal Hill Hospital in Lexington. In June of 1973, he started a second nursing job at Lexington's Good Samaritan Hospital. He worked both jobs simultaneously until deciding to move on to other positions. Between August 1974 and September 1975, he worked first as a telephone operator in Lexington and then as a clerk at St. Luke's Hospital in Fort Thomas, Kentucky. For some reason, Donald was able to control his urge to kill during this time. It's possible that he simply did not have the same access to the patients as he did at his previous workplace, which could also explain why he shifted from job to job during this time. Despite his efforts to keep his killing urges in check, his inner demons slowly became increasingly more difficult to manage, finally driving them across the state line into Cincinnati, Ohio. In September 1975, Donald moved back to Cincinnati, and within weeks, he started working the night shift at the Cincinnati VA Medical Hospital. He worked there as a nursing assistant, housekeeping aide, cardiac catheterization technician, and autopsy assistant. As he became more comfortable in a hospital setting once again, he started right where he had left off. Since he worked at night, he had very little supervision and unlimited access to all the areas of the hospital. Over the course of the following 10 years, Donald would end up murdering at least 15 patients while working at the hospital. To relish all his crimes, he even kept a detailed diary of his murders and took notes on each victim. These grisly details included sprinkling rat poison in a patient's dessert, pressing a plastic bag and wet towel over the mouth and nose, injecting cyanide into an intravenous tube, adding arsenic and cyanide to orange juice, injecting cyanide into a patient's buttocks, and many more. Yet, the depravity of his crimes did not end there. Throughout his murder spree, Donald was experimenting with different methods based on medical journals he was studying for hints as to how to better conceal his crimes. Cyanide soon became his favorite tool for murder. He'd mix it into the victim's food or pour it directly into their gastric tube. Over the years, He amassed an astounding 30 pounds of cyanide, which he had slowly pilfered from the hospital. He would keep his deadly supply at home for safekeeping. Despite all the deaths, Donald Harvey always managed to stay under anyone's radar. He had carefully set up all of his killing to look like accidents or natural causes. Donald even earned himself the nickname the Angel of Death and the Kiss of Death amongst his co-workers. They all thought it was a coincidence that he was always around when these deaths occurred. Little did they suspect that their charming co-worker was a silent creditor. Although years down the line, Donald insisted that his crimes were merely an act of mercy motivated by compassion, there were other crimes that speak otherwise. The beginning of 1980s brought out variations in both Donald's life and his crimes. Without a doubt, these crimes were purely driven by rage and revenge. In the early 1980s, Donald briefly began dating a man named Doug Hill. The relationship was challenging from the start as they argued on a regular basis. After one of those heated fights, Donald retaliated by slipping arsenic into Doug's ice cream. Although he survived, the incident signified the first instance where Donald tried to harm someone outside of the hospital. This was a chilling sign that the monster had begun to stretch his boundaries. Following another follow-up with Doug, Donald moved in with another lover, Colonel Howler, within a short period of time. The relationship was going well in the beginning before Donald suspected Howler of cheating on him. Out of jealousy, he would add small doses of arsenic into Howler's food so that he would be too ill to leave their apartment. At this point, Donald's acts of revenge were no longer limited to his home or workplace. On one occasion, following an argument, he laced one of the beverages of his female neighbor with hepatitis serum, which nearly killed her before the infection was diagnosed and treated. While luck was on her side, it wouldn't be the same for another of Donald's neighbors, Helen Metzger. The arsenic he put in one of her pies caused her death at a local hospital a week later. Donald's confidence was soaring high after getting away with so many murders. He must have felt invincible. In April 1983, after tiff with Howler's parents, Donald regularly began to poison their food with arsenic and salt doses. On May 1, 1983, Howler's father, Henry, suffered a stroke and was admitted to Providence Hospital. To complete his unfinished business, Donald placed arsenic in his pudding before leaving during a hospital visit. Sadly, the elderly man died later that night. Donald continued to poison Carl's mother, Margaret, off and on for the next year, but was unsuccessful in his attempts to kill her. In January 1984, Howler broke up with Donald and asked him to move out. Needless to say, Donald was not happy about it. Unable to accept the rejection, he spent the next 2 years trying to kill his former partner with his poisonous concoctions. As a means of revenge, Donald even went to great lengths in an unsuccessful murder attempt against one of Howler's female friends. Though he managed to land Howler in the hospital at one point, his attempts to eliminate him from the face of the earth had failed. The first cloud of suspicion that loomed over Donald's head was on July 18, 1985, when security guards noticed Donald acting suspiciously and decided to search his gym bag. Inside the haversack, the guards discovered a .38 caliber pistol, hypodermic needles, surgical scissors, gloves, a cocaine spoon, various medical texts, 2 occult books, and a biography of serial killer Charles Sobridge. Fined $50 for carrying a firearm on federal property. Donald was then given the option to quietly resign from his job rather than be fired. Call it a stroke of luck or pure negligence from law enforcement side, none of these ever appeared in his work record, and the hospital authorities did not open an investigation to determine if the man was responsible for any other crimes while working at the hospital. It took Donald 7 months to secure another job at a local hospital. In February of 1986, he started working as a part-time nurse's aide at Drake Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati. Unaware of his past and impressed by his performance, his new employers soon offered him a full-time position at the hospital. Before long, Donald settled back into his old routine. Over the next 13 months, Harvey murdered another 26 patients and attempted to kill several more by disconnecting life support machines, injecting iron to veins, causing suffocation, and injecting arsenic, cyanide, and petroleum-based cleaners. The 2-decade-long murder spree came to an end with one last murder. On March 7, 1987, a 44-year-old patient, John Powell, mysteriously died. Powell was on life support from a bad motorcycle accident for several months before his demise, but had since started to recover. Due to Ohio's law of a mandatory autopsy for a vehicular homicide, this death landed Donald in a situation that he had never faced before. During the autopsy, an assistant coroner noticed the faint scent of almonds, which is a telltale sign of cyanide. Authorities got involved in the death following this concerning discovery. Initially, suspicion fell upon the people closer to Powell, but investigators failed to come up with any evidence or a motive pointing toward any of Powell's friends or family members. So it did not take them long to focus on hospital employees who had access to Powell's room. Donald Harvey was one of those names on the short list. To rule out their names, hospital employees at this point were volunteering to take polygraph tests. Donald also volunteered to take a test and even bought a book on how to beat lie detector tests. But eventually, he did not go through with the test and called in sick on the day of his scheduled appointment. If this was not concerning enough, investigators learned about his questionable department from the VA hospital as well as his notorious hospital nickname, Angel of Death. Given the numerous unusual deaths that seemed to surround him, authorities began to focus their entire investigation on Donald. He was brought in for questioning. In the initial interrogation phase, Donald denied having anything to do with Powell's murder and portrayed himself as a victim of coincidence. It was only after hours of questioning and playing a bit of good cop, bad cop that he finally confessed to having put cyanide in John Powell's G-tube. He tried to explain that it was because he felt sorry for him and his family. He still denied responsibility for any of the other suspicious deaths. Donald was taken into custody while investigators began to look for other evidence. On August 11, 1987, Donald Harvey, 35 at the time, sat down with investigators and confessed to committing 33 murders over the previous 17 years. The number grew to 7.80 in total as the days passed. Investigators wanted Donald to be checked for his mental state before his claims were taken to be accurate, as they were doubtful of the numbers Donald provided them. Following several psychiatric tests by numerous experts, it was determined that Donald knew the difference between right and wrong and was able to conform to the conduct of the law. Hence, he was sane and competent. In November of 1987, Donald Harvey was sentenced to 8 life terms plus 20 years for the murders in Marysmount Hospital. In February 1988, he entered guilty pleas on 3 additional Cincinnati homicides and 3 attempted murders, drawing 3 life sentences plus 3 terms of 7 to 25 years. The investigation into the remaining deaths were closed after 2 years as investigators determined that there was not enough evidence to implicate him in the murders. Whether people were stunned or disgusted by his actions, they definitely were intrigued to know what went on inside his sick mind. In the 1991 interview, a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch asked Donald Harvey about his motive behind the killings. Giving away a rare glimpse inside his mind, Donald said that the reign of terror began with a desire for control. In his eyes, people controlled him for 18 years, and then he controlled his own destiny. He loved the power and to be able to control whether people lived or died. Even in the world of serial killers, Donald Harvey holds a special place, not only because of his overwhelming kill count, but also because of his choice to kill people he personally knew in addition to his patients. According to an article published on July 23, 2001 by the Associated Press listing the worst serial killers in the United States, Donald Harvey held the number 1 place, even surpassing the notorious John Wayne Gacy. While everyone expected Donald Harvey to spend his days behind bars, and unlike his unfortunate victims, die a natural death, destiny had something else in store for him. On March 28, 2017, 64-year-old Donald Harvey was found badly beaten inside his cell in protective custody at the Toledo Correctional Institution in Lucas County. He would die 2 days later at the age of 64 from blunt head trauma due to skull fracture and brain damage. Months after the death, an inmate named James D. Elliott, serving 37 years for numerous burglary offenses, would later write the Toledo Blade and confess to the murder. In those letters, Elliott confessed to punching and stomping on Donald in his cell. He said he grew up in Kentucky near some relatives of Donald's victims and claimed that he committed the crime to give them some closure and peace of mind. Hopefully, everyone from our area will take some solace in the fact that one of their own gave Harvey the punishment that he should have gotten from the courts. Elliott was quoted as writing, In September 2019, Elliot was sentenced to life in prison after pleading guilty to the murder of the infamous Angel of Death. To his last day, Donald Harvey insisted that the majority of his killings were out of mercy. But the truth is, in the process of becoming a murderer from a nurse, Donald appointed himself the judge, jury, and executioner over people's lives. Perhaps because he was not caught for decades, he assumed it was his right to control other people's lives. This is a story of survival that is hard to put into words. The bravery of 8-year-old Jennifer Schutt is beyond measure, and her actions in critical circumstances are remarkable. It's a rare case where the victim aided in apprehending her attacker. Despite losing her ability to speak due to a horrific injury, Jennifer survived, retaining every detail. Over 19 years, she relentlessly continued to pursue her own case, and in the end, she got her way. Jennifer Schutt, an 8-year-old schoolgirl, had recently finished school. She lived with her single mother, Elaine, who did everything possible to ensure her daughter's happiness and well-being. Elaine worked multiple jobs to support the family and provide Jennifer with a joyful childhood. Surrounded by such love and care, Jennifer blossomed into a lively and cheerful child, embracing learning with enthusiasm and displaying a keen intellect and curiosity. At such a young age, children are often afraid of the dark, and Jennifer was no exception. She had a fear of the dark and frequently slept alongside her mother in the same room. That night, on August 9, 2009, the mother and daughter slept in the same room. Jennifer was tossing and turning, kicking her mom in sleep, making it difficult for her to fall asleep. Unusually, at 2:30 a.m., Elaine woke up and asked Jennifer to go back to her own room for the rest of the night because she needed to get up early for work. Understandingly, Jennifer responded to her mother saying, "Just because I love you, Mom, I'm going to sleep in my own room tonight," and went to her room. Elaine would later regret this decision for a long time. But at that moment, she couldn't know she noticed that the window facing the parking lot was wide open. Elaine promptly called 911. Upon the police's arrival, she recounted that she hadn't heard any noise or screams after Jennifer went to her room. It is worth mentioning that their apartment was on the first floor and the windows in Jennifer's room overlooked the parking lot, leading Elaine to fear that someone might have seen Jennifer and entered the room through the window. Elaine realized that their apartment was not the ideal living situation for her and her young daughter, but it was the best they could afford at the time. Nevertheless, Elaine's parents decided to help her and their granddaughter with a new place to live. They purchased a small house nearby and renovated it. Jennifer and her mother were supposed to move there in a few months, and they had been there the day before Jennifer went missing. They were working in the garden where Jennifer was bitten by mosquitoes, which prevented her from sleeping peacefully that night. After her daughter's disappearance, Elaine was devastated. She said that Jennifer was all she had and pleaded for her return. The police worked tirelessly to locate her. Luckily, Elaine didn't have to wait long for news. Around 6:30 p.m. that same day, the police received a call from parents whose children were playing in a field and accidentally stumbled upon something. To their horror, they realized it was the body of a young girl. Upon arriving at the scene, the police found the body of 8-year-old Jennifer Schutt lying in the middle of the field, 5 kilometers from her home. Jennifer's condition was grave, but she was still breathing. Her throat had been cut from ear to ear. The main life-threatening injury for Jennifer was a wide wound on her throat, which caused her to lose a lot of blood and made her extremely pale and weak. Jennifer was taken to the hospital in critical condition where doctors fought to save her life. When she regained consciousness after the surgery, her behavior underwent a sudden change. It turned out that she was afraid of all men. I was kind of a hard patient to deal with because I had a lot of male doctors and I was scared of males. Additionally, the Dickinson Police Department deployed a whole team to guard her hospital room. Throughout this time, Jennifer was in a constant state of panic. She even hit a doctor in the stomach when he tried to approach her. Elaine tried to reassure her daughter, explaining that all these people were there to care for her and help her. However, Jennifer didn't trust anyone. Her behavior became more understandable when she finally revealed what had happened to her that night. Jennifer could not directly inform the investigator of anything. To obtain any information, the detectives gave her a notebook and several pens asking her to answer questions in writing. Due to her fear of men, Jennifer wrote notes to her mother, who then passed them to the officer. Jennifer's responses were surprisingly precise, detailing the events accurately. Despite being only 8 years old, she displayed remarkable intelligence for her age. She started by going into her room, turning on the light, and picking up a book to read, hoping it would help her sleep, which it did. Jennifer fell asleep. The next thing she knew, a stranger was carrying her out of the house. Afterward, he placed Jennifer in the car claiming to be an undercover police officer. She later confessed that she immediately felt that something was wrong. Looking around, she saw her mother's car in the parking lot, so she was confused about where they were going and why. On the one hand, she knew that the police were good guys, but on the other hand, her mother had taught her not to trust strangers. As they passed her grandparents' house, Jennifer told the stranger that he could drop her off at their house, to which he replied, "I can't because they're not home." And then she realized he was lying because their car was in the driveway. Later, the man stopped near Jennifer's school, about 3 kilometers from her home. He then said to watch the moon carefully. When it changed color, her mother would come for her. 5 minutes passed and the stranger said, "Well, your mom's not coming, so we need to go further." They drove a few more blocks to a dead-end street where the strangers stopped the car. Jennifer tried once again to make sure he was a real policeman. Jennifer turned around to search for it, and at that moment, the suspicious policeman took off her underwear. Jennifer is unsure of how long she was in the stranger's grip because she blacked out. She first regained consciousness when he was dragging her through the field by her ankles. Despite the excruciating pain from twigs and stones digging into her back, Jennifer pretended to be dead and stayed silent. He let go of her feet and left her in the field. Jennifer only heard him walking away. Then she heard his car door slam and him drive away. I realized I couldn't scream, and I couldn't figure out why. I had just enough strength to throw my right hand on top of my neck, and that's when I felt a gaping wind. And I looked at my hand, and earth flowed gladly. Since the exact time of Jennifer's disappearance is unknown, it is believed that she lay in the field for 12 to 14 hours. When the sun set, she saw the lights of passing cars. Nearby, she heard children's voices, and a dog approached her several times as if trying to get the attention of its owner, but he never came. Throughout, she was bitten by fire ants, which helped her stay conscious. Anytime I'll in until I would be in disbelief that I hadn't died yet. Jennifer said she wasn't afraid and had even accepted that she might not survive. But suddenly, she heard children's voices nearby, and at that moment, something hit her leg. The next time Jennifer regained consciousness, she heard a police officer repeating if then found, "You're gonna be okay. Just please stay with me. Please stay with me." And I remember being put into the life flight helicopter. This story was very challenging for young Jennifer as she couldn't speak and had to write everything down on paper. Moreover, her fear of men complicated the situation. So her mother asked all the questions, and Jennifer's answers were relayed to the officers who were behind the door. Incredibly, 8-year-old Jennifer even managed to get the stranger's name from him. I just remember remembering his name, and so I wrote he felt his name was Dennis. I remember then that he looked griefy and like he may have had a scar or something on his face. For days after her disappearance, the police requested the services of forensic artist Lois Gibson, who communicated with Jennifer solely through gestures and notes. Despite these challenges, they managed to create an incredibly detailed composite sketch. It was shown to the public in hopes that someone would identify the man. Meanwhile, the police continued to comb through the crime scene and found Jennifer's clothing about half a mile away, along with a man's shirt and underwear. Although there was hope that DNA on the clothing would lead to the perpetrator, no matches were found. Jennifer's recovery was gradual. She showed remarkable resilience despite still being a child. There was a moment when she got upset over a chocolate bar she couldn't eat, screamed in frustration, and a faint sound escaped her mouth. Doctors were shocked because her vocal cords were almost severed, and they never expected them to heal. But somehow they began to mend. I like to see how to set up then. Soon after, Jennifer was discharged from the hospital. She not only returned home, but also went back to school. After completing her schooling and college education, Jennifer decided to pursue a career as a children's librarian. However, she never forgot what happened that night. Each day felt like a hunt for the criminal. Could be anyone. This could be our neighbor. This could be someone at the post office, someone at the grocery store. If he watched and left, is he gonna come back and finish me off? Fortunately, Jennifer met a guy named Jonathan, and for the first time in many years, she trusted a man, and they fell in love. However, at the same time, the trail of her attacker grew colder. The chances of him being found were slim, and the case showed no progress despite being passed from one investigator to another. 18 years after that dreadful night, Jennifer received a phone call. I got a phone call that Detective Tim Cromie would be taking over my case, and he wanted to meet with me. Tim Cromie promised to do everything possible to catch the criminal, and Jennifer believed him. And I told her, I said, Jennifer, I will do whatever I can do in my power till the end of my career to get you the answers that you, Tim, and Richard discovered the significant amount of evidence collected on the day Jennifer went missing and immediately after she was found, with Jennifer's underwear being particularly crucial as well as the perpetrator's shirt and underwear. They sent a DNA sample found on the clothing to Quantico, Virginia. Although detectives knew that technology had advanced significantly in 19 years, they understood that the case's age meant it would not be a priority in the lab. Often working cold cases, time is your enemy. People forget, people move away, people die. This was one of the benefits of time in our case was the advances of technology in the DNA field. Despite a whole year passing, their work was rewarded. The man whose DNA was found at the crime scene was Dennis Earl Bradford. Who is that? The same man Jennifer had written down many years ago. It turned out that the 8-year-old girl had been incredibly accurate in her descriptions. Jennifer was 8 years old, on pain medication, couldn't speak, and hand wrote down he said his name was Dennis. At that point, it was monumental that this girl was so accurate. Of course, later we found out how accurate she was on everything. Dennis Bradford, 39, lived in North Little Rock, Arkansas, and his DNA was logged into the national database following an assault on a woman he met at a bar in 1996. Although sentenced to 12 years in prison, he only served 4. On February 4, 2000, Dennis was conditionally released. Less than a year later, police arrested Bradford for driving under the influence less than half a mile from his home. He remarried and worked as a welder until his arrest in 2009. Tim Cromie and Richard Renison investigated the link between the suspect from North Little Rock, Arkansas, and the small town of Dickinson, Texas. It turned out that the man had been arrested in Dickinson in 1987, 3 years before Jennifer's attack. At that time, he had 2 addresses within 2 miles of Jennifer and Elaine's apartment. To confirm his identity as the kidnapper, detectives requested a 19-year-old photo from his driver's license. When they saw the picture, they were stunned. He looked like a copy of the composite sketch created with the help of 8-year-old Jennifer. Dennis Earl Bradford was arrested on October 19, 2009. He insisted he didn't know Jennifer, couldn't recall why he had stopped near her apartment, and couldn't comprehend why he had treated her so cruelly. Dennis also revealed an interesting detail that investigators didn't know. After the attack, he was overwhelmed with guilt, and he attempted suicide with a shotgun. Bradford wanted to pull the trigger, but changed his mind. Afterward, he was admitted to the psychiatric ward, which happened to be the same hospital that Jennifer was still in. Even at that time, he was so close to her. Immediately after the interrogation, detectives informed Jennifer that the criminal they had been searching for 19 years was arrested. Though he never met her face to face, Reese's mother was good friends with Tiffany's mother. Reese even called Kathy shortly after Tiffany's death and shared condolences for her untimely death. But once again, Reese would elude justice as police were unable to gather any clues to link him with Tiffany's murder, and the case went unsolved for quite some time. In 2015, investigators finally got a breakthrough in Tiffany Johnston's case. By then, DNA technology had advanced massively. A DNA swab that was taken from the state medical examiner's office during the autopsy of Tiffany was sent to the lab for DNA testing. The DNA profile got a hit in the Cody's database and implicated William Rees in the crime. In September of 2015, William Rees was charged in Oklahoma City with the 1997 kidnapping and murder of Tiffany Johnston. But just before his trial was set to begin, in an unexpected twist, he started confessing to other crimes in an attempt to cut a deal with the prosecution. He eluded the police. They have lived for 90 years. Ryan Lee's had criminalized, and I don't know it to him. But the shades of the truth, already suspecting him in the murder of Laura Smither and the disappearances of Jessica Kane and Kelly Cox, detectives put a bunch of photos of the three victims before him. He immediately accepted responsibility but continued to deny any sexual motive behind the crimes. He also agreed to show investigators to the site where it claimed the remains of Kelly and Jessica were buried on the condition that they would not seek the death penalty. In April of 2016, Rees led the investigators to a site in Houston Pasture where human remains were found after several days of digging. The remains were later confirmed by the Harris County Medical Examiner's offices as belonging to Jessica Kane. From there, the search moved through a burial site in Brazoria County where they found another set of human remains. Through dental records, the remains were positively identified as Kelly Cox. The trial for Tiffany Johnston's murder began in May of 2021 in the Oklahoma County District Court. On May 28, 2021, he was found guilty by the jury. On August 19, 2021, the judge sentenced him to death for Tiffany's abduction and murder. Following his conviction for murder in Oklahoma, Rees was extradited to stand trial in Texas in early March 2022 for the murders of Laura Smither, Kelly Cox, and Jessica Kane. He pleaded guilty to all three murders and was sentenced to life imprisonment in June 2022. For families waited for decades to get answers regarding the fate of their loved ones, while the person responsible for these crimes selfishly kept these secrets to himself. It's saddening to see that he would only give these poor families the answers they so desperately needed to suit his own personal needs. We can only hope that the families can finally begin the healing process and find comfort in being able to give their loved ones a proper burial after all these years. They encountered the Wong guy in the wild place at the Wong Tai. Angie Dodge was born on December 21, 1977, in Washington State, the youngest of her parents' 4 children and their only daughter. She loved Christmas, as it was just a few days after her birthday, and each year, both occasions were celebrated with a large family gathering. The family moved to San Diego before eventually settling in Idaho Falls, Idaho. Angie had a deep appreciation for the outdoors, and camping with her family was one of her favorite activities. Academically gifted, Angie excelled in school and tutored her peers in math and English at Idaho Falls High School, where she graduated in 1995. She briefly attended Idaho State University before deciding to move out of her family home in May 1996. After a disagreement over breaking a house rule, Angie, at 18, began living independently. She worked at a local beauty supply store, which allowed her to rent an apartment on the second floor of a converted house on I Street in Idaho Falls. On the evening of June 12, 1996, 3 weeks after moving out, Angie visited her mother, Carol, around 9:15 p.m. They sat together on the couch, talking about Angie's excitement about being on her own, mixed with the challenges of growing up. Angie rested her head on her mother's shoulder, and Carol lovingly told her that she would always be her baby. Around 10:20 p.m., Angie left, and as she drove away, she and Carol exchanged kisses and mouthed, "I love you." Tragically, that was the last time Carol would see her daughter. The following morning, June 13th, Angie failed to show up to work, which was highly unusual. Her co-workers were worried about her, and one of them went to her apartment to check on her. They arrived just after 11 a.m. and entered Angie's apartment through its unlocked front door. They found Angie's body on the floor of her bedroom. She had been stabbed multiple times, and her throat had been slashed. Angie had also been raped, and semen and foreign hairs were found on her body. DNA testing showed that they came from the same individual. While the DNA evidence could be used to prove a suspect's involvement in the crime, the Idaho Falls police first needed a suspect to compare it to, and for several months, they could not identify a promising one. Then, in January of 1997, 7. An acquaintance of Angie's named Brian Hobbs was charged with raping a woman at knife point in Nevada. Because of his connection to Angie and the details of this crime, police in Idaho Falls began looking at Brian Hobbs as a potential suspect while he was still in custody in Nevada. As part of their investigation, they began questioning numerous friends and associates of Dobbs in Idaho. One of these individuals was a man named Christopher Tapp. Chris Tapp was 20 years old and a high school dropout. When he came in to speak to police and provide a DNA sample, he denied having any knowledge of the crime or playing any part in it. However, after being polygraphed 7 times and interrogated 9 times for a total of 28 hours over the course of 23 days, Christopher confessed to being involved in Angie's murder. He was charged in the case in February of 1997. Despite his confession, Christopher Tapp pled not guilty to Angie's rape and murder, and his trial began on May 2, 1998. His DNA did not match that found at the crime scene, and no physical evidence tied him to the crime. A witness, Destiny Osborne, testified at the trial that she had heard Tapp and Brian Hobbs discussing Angie's murder at a party several days after it occurred while she was high on methamphetamine. The prosecution's main evidence against Tapp was his confession. On May 28, 1998, after 13 hours of deliberation, the jury found Christopher Tapp guilty of first-degree murder and rape, because he had confessed and would not have been convicted without that confession. The judge at his sentencing hearing sentenced Tapp to life in prison with a 30-year minimum term rather than imposing the death penalty as Carol Dodge had requested. While there had been a conviction in Angie's case, it was still not completely solved. Because the DNA found on Angie's body did not belong to Christopher Tapp, prosecutors argued that at least one other person had been involved in Angie's rape and murder. Carol Dodge was determined to bring this other individual to justice. She did not believe Tapp's claims of his innocence and did everything she could to get him to reveal the identity of the person whose DNA was left at the crime scene. She visited him in prison and begged him to tell her her daughter's last words and the identity of the other man involved. She was livid when he told her he did not know. Carol spent years focused on the task of getting justice for her daughter, reviewing documents, questioning Angie's neighbors, and investigating every detail of the case on her own. However, the specifics of that mission did eventually change slightly many years after Christopher Tapp's conviction. While she had originally been confident in Tapp's guilt in the crime, she changed her mind after finally gaining access to the recordings of his interviews and polygraphs. Tapp had originally denied knowing anything about the crime. He would eventually provide police with 6 different stories about what happened to Angie based on information they provided him. He did not understand that the police could lie to him, so when they told him they had absolute proof that Brian Hobbs was involved, which they did not, Tapp told them that Hobbs had confessed to him and asked him to be his alibi. After a series of immunity agreements began coming into play under which Tapp would only have to plead guilty to aiding and abetting an aggravated battery, police got him to say that he had been at Angie's apartment and witnessed the crime. Police ran into a problem, however, when the results from the DNA tests on Tapp and Hobbs came in. Neither man was a match to the DNA at the crime scene. They then suggested to Tapp that another one of his friends, Jeremy Sargis, had been involved in the crime. Tapp now said that he had witnessed Sargis and Hobbs commit the rape and murder. When Sargis' DNA was tested, it was also not a match to the crime scene DNA, and police were able to confirm his alibi for the night of Angie's murder. They then voided Tapp's immunity agreements. In Tapp's final story, the one presented at trial, he said he held Angie down by the wrists during her assault and made some of the cuts found on her body. Hobbs and another man he could not identify beyond the first name of Mike were the other participants. Hobbs was never charged in the case. The tapes of the interrogation show Tapp being intimidated and fed information, but it was really the tapes of the polygraph examinations that made Carol understand why Tapp would make a false confession. A polygraph expert would later say that the test was used as a psychological rubber hose against Tapp. Michael Heavey, a retired Superior Court judge from Washington State, who would eventually work on Tapp's case through the group Judges for Justice, argues that the detectives involved broke the rules that surround the administration of polygraph examinations, likely because they did not believe anyone would ever watch the tapes of the exams, as polygraph results are not admissible in court. Judge Heavey argues that rather than use the exams to determine Tapp's credibility as they are intended, The authorities in this case used them to brainwash Christopher Tapp and trick him into providing false testimony. During one of his polygraph exams, Tapp is threatened with dying in the gas chamber. Threats are not to be used in these situations specifically because they can lead to false confessions. The administrators of the test also convinced Tapp that the machine was telling them that he was lying when he said he was not involved in the crime and that it was infallible. He must have suppressed the memory of the murder because the machine could read his subconscious and it said that he was involved. Tapp at one point asks the administrator if he had committed the crime. Tapp was provided with details of the crime and suggested answers to the questions he was being asked. When Tapp finally said he had stabbed Angie during the polygraph, one of the police officers in the room came over and shook his hand. Tapp was told he had passed the test by providing this answer, but the report from this polygraph shows that he was actually being deceptive when he said he had stabbed Angie. Carol Dodge was convinced of Tapp's innocence and believed that the just thing to do would be release him from prison. The woman who had previously asked for Tapp to receive the death penalty now became one of his biggest advocates. She contacted Stephen Drizin, a professor at Northwestern University's Pritzker School of Law and a leading expert in false confessions, asking for his help in Tapp's case. He was familiar with the case because he had been talking to Tapp's legal team for over a year, and he agreed to work on it pro bono after speaking with Carol. His 2014 report found that Tapp's confession had been coerced and was the product of deceit and pressure from the authorities, who had then provided Tapp with enough details about the crime and the crime scene to make the confession seem credible. Tapp's case received the attention of and help from several organizations over the years. In addition to Judges for Justice, the Idaho Innocence took on the case in 2007, and the Innocence Project of New York also did work on the case. This help was invaluable because Tapp's legal battle to prove his innocence and overturn his conviction had not been going well. Following his 2001 appeal, the Idaho Court of Appeals had ruled that Tapp's Miranda rights had been violated during many of his interviews with police, but that these violations were harmless. His appeals and petitions for post-conviction relief, which his mother, Vera, had mortgaged her home and spent years working 2 jobs to pay the legal fees for, all failed. The videos of the interrogations and polygraphs, as well as new DNA evidence, gave Tapp new hope. In his final story to police, Tapp had said that he had held Angie down by the wrists during her attack. Angie's hands had been swabbed as a part of the initial investigation, but those samples were never tested even after prosecutors went to court to argue that Tapp had touched her specifically on that part of her body. They were finally tested in 2016 and only found Angie's DNA and that of the person whose semen had been found on her. Further testing of other objects from the scene, such as Angie's blanket and a blood-stained teddy bear, also failed to find Tapp's DNA. Destiny Osborne, who had testified against Tapp at his trial, also recanted her testimony in 2017. She claimed that, like Tapp's confession, her testimony had been coerced by police who threatened her with drug charges after her release from the behavioral health center where she had been held on an unrelated offense. I was manipulated and coerced and said a huge story and threatened 23 years ago by the many members of the Idaho Falls Police Department to falsely testify against Chris Tapp, Osborne told the Idaho Falls Post-Register in 2019. In the fall of 2016, Christopher Tapp's lawyers met with Bonneville County Prosecuting Attorney Daniel Clark. Rather than pursue Tapp's 2 pending appeals, Clark agreed to drop Tapp's rape conviction. The murder conviction would still stand, but Tapp would be allowed to leave prison, having served 20 years. Christopher Tapp was not quick to agree to these terms. He still maintained his innocence and did not want the murder conviction to stay on his record. However, in March of 2017, he agreed to the terms. "I took the lesser of 2 evils," he later told the Idaho Statesman. "I've been fighting this for 20 years. When you lose so many hearings and lose so many battles, you continue to lose faith in the justice system." Carol Dodge and her son Brent Dodge were present at and spoke during Tapp's release hearing. "Chris, the day we were here and chose your jury, the jury that convicted you, little did we know what we know now," Carol said. "For 13 years, I was really angry at you, and of course you were angry at me. I had a hardened heart because for 13 years they programmed my mind to believe you were part of my daughter's killing." While Brent and Carol did not believe Tapp was involved in Angie's murder, they were glad that a way to have him released had been found even if he had not been fully exonerated. Although the agreement is not perfect, It does provide the catalyst by which healing can take place, Brent said to the court. So, Your Honor, on behalf of our family and Angie, we absolutely recommend Chris be set free. Absolutely. On March 22, 2017, Christopher Tapp left the Bonneville County Courthouse after the release hearing as a free man. That same day, he visited the grave of his father who passed away while Chris was incarcerated for the first time. While prosecutor Daniel Clark accepted the deal that set Chris Tapp free, he did not necessarily accept the notion that Chris Tapp was innocent. In July of 2015, facing pressure from the various advocacy groups working on Tapp's case, he commissioned an independent investigation into it. The investigation came to an end in the fall of 2016, and Clark maintains that it did not uncover any new, credible, and material evidence that Tapp is innocent. In a formal statement released the same day Tapp was released from custody, Clark said, "To be clear, there is not sufficient evidence to prove Tapp is innocent, which is the proper legal question at this time." He would later describe the deal to the Idaho Statesman as a means to an end. While Carol Dodge's advocacy had helped secure Chris Tapp's freedom, her work was not yet finished. He had not yet been exonerated, and Angie's real killer had not been brought to justice. Carol focused on the main piece of evidence in the case, the DNA, believing it would be what would finally identify the man who had killed her daughter. Even before Chris Tapp was released from prison, the Idaho Falls Police had been looking into using new DNA techniques to identify the man whose semen and hair had been left on Angie's body. In 2014, they used a public genealogy database to attempt to identify the killer. They looked at a public genealogy database that had originally been developed by the Sorensen Molecular Genealogy Foundation but had since been acquired by Ancestry.com. After they were compelled to provide information to the police via warrant, Ancestry.com implemented protections to ensure that they would not have to do so in the future. Authorities used Y chromosome analysis to search the database and look for a match to the DNA from the crime scene. They found a man in the database who was a close but not identical match to the DNA at the crime scene. That man was Michael Ussery Sr., who had submitted his DNA to database as part of a genealogy project at his local church. Since he was not a perfect match, authorities began looking at his male relatives. Ussery had a son, Michael Jr., who was a filmmaker living in Louisiana. He had been 17 at the time of Angie's murder and had briefly visited Idaho in 1996. Police in Idaho Falls obtained a search warrant, compelling him to provide a DNA sample. Michael was also interviewed about the case and denied any involvement in it. His DNA was not a match to the DNA from the crime scene, and he was cleared. The effort had not solved the case. Carol Dodge, however, was not ready to give up on the idea of using DNA or genealogy databases to identify Angie's killer. In November of 2018, the crime scene DNA was sent to Parabon Nanolabs. Genetic genealogist C.C. Moore originally did not believe that she and her team could be of service in the case. The DNA had degraded over the years and was just barely within the range of what Moore was willing to work with. However, Carol Dodge then called her and convinced her to take on Angie's case. Moore submitted the DNA profile to GeneMatch, which allowed her to compare its autosomal DNA to the samples in the database. The 2014 effort had only examined and compared DNA on the Y chromosome. When the team from Parabon submitted their findings to the Idaho Falls Police Department in early 2019, they had identified 6 potential suspects who were distantly related to the Ussery family police had looked at in 2014. DNA samples were surreptitiously collected from these men, and they were eliminated. Furthermore, analysis of their DNA found that they were not closely related to Angie's killer. C.C. Moore realized that there must be an unidentified member of the family tree she was missing. She eventually turned her attention to a young woman who had married into the family at a young age. That marriage ended in divorce, and the woman later remarried. While she did not appear to have a child during her first marriage, she gave birth shortly after it ended. But the child grew up with his stepfather's surname, which was why he had not been identified as a member of the family originally. Moore and her team were able to locate the woman's mother's obituary with the help of a small local library, and it listed her daughter with her new last name and the names of her children. The new potential suspect was named Brian Drips, and there was a 53-year-old man with that name currently living in Caldwell, Idaho. Police from Idaho Falls traveled to Caldwell to surveil Drips and hopefully collect an item he discarded that would have his DNA on it. Drips was a smoker and police were eventually able to collect a cigarette, but they saw him discard. When the DNA on that cigarette was analyzed, it was found to be a match to the DNA found on Angie Dodge's body. On May 15, 2019, Brian Drips was brought in for questioning. He originally denied any involvement in the case, but once he was informed that his DNA had been matched to the DNA found at the crime scene, he confessed to both the rape and murder. Drips had lived across the street from Angie and had been interviewed by police about her murder just days after her death as part of the neighborhood canvass. During his confession, he claimed that he entered Angie's apartment with the intention of raping her, but had not planned on killing her. He also said that he had acted alone and did not know Christopher Tapp. Following his confession, Drips was arrested and charged with Angie's rape and murder. At the press conference announcing Drips' arrest, Idaho Falls Police Chief Bryce Johnson acknowledged the role that Carol Dodge played in keeping Angie's case alive. "Carol inspired us all to try harder and do better," he said. "Carol, for 23 years, every day, every second of every day, she's been looking out for her daughter." This case begins and ends with Carol. On July 11, 2019, prosecuting attorney Daniel Clark filed a motion requesting that the court vacate Christopher Tapp's murder conviction. There exists clear and convincing evidence that Tapp was convicted of a crime he did not commit, Clark wrote in the filing. Therefore, the state moves that the court grant post-conviction relief, set aside the jury verdict and vacate the judgment of conviction, and dismiss the case. On July 17th, Chris Tapp was in court for a hearing in the matter. Judge Alan Stevens approved the motion and told Tapp, "As far as the court is concerned, you are cleared of the charges you have been living under for the past 20-plus years." Christopher Tapp became the first person to ever be exonerated with the use of genetic genealogy. Carol Dodge was in court to see his name finally be cleared. Chris was able to find work after his release from prison and was working at a plastic bag at the time of his exoneration. His opportunities have been limited due to the murder conviction on his record, but his exoneration eliminates that problem. He is relieved to have finally restored his family's good name for his mother. In December 2019, he filed suit against the Idaho Falls Police Department and several individual detectives and officers seeking damages for false imprisonment and arrest, malicious prosecution, libel, negligence, and emotional harm and distress. Brian Drips remains in custody awaiting his trial, which is currently set to begin on June 8, 2021. His lawyer is currently petitioning for his confession to be thrown out and for a change of venue due to local media coverage of the case. Carol Dodge is frustrated by the long wait for the trial and worried she will be unable to make the frequent trips to another part of the state for the trial and other hearings related to the case. "Angie's case is just as well known over there as it is here," she pointed out. Despite the challenges she has faced and the twists and turns the case has taken over the past 2 decades, Carol remains just as committed as ever to making sure that justice is served in Angie's case. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.